Hi, everybody. It's Lee. I'm back again. I'm with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I'm here with our resident expert.
My name is Tracy Underwood, and I am also with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I work on our economic justice project. And so I'm going to be here talking to you today about how survivors navigate TANF and child support systems.
And the reason why I asked Tracy if she would pull this webinar together is, you know, when Eileen, many of you may have met Eileen Stoll and I when we do the trainings around domestic violence assessment and response and the safer planning trainings. And we've just been asking home visitors if they're familiar with options for families when they're involved with TANF around activities that they may be required to do when domestic violence or coercion abuse is happening, or child support. And we got a range of answers, and we thought it would be great to just like pull this information together. We are recording today, so eventually it'll be up on our website. We hope you came with your questions and stories and things you want to get answered. So I'm going to turn it now back over to Tracy. Take it away.
All righty. So, oh, why is that not advancing? Oops, oops. Oh, hey, there's us. A very old picture because we didn't manage to take a new one. But, and our contact information. So you'll, will we be able to get them this PowerPoint? Yes. You'll be able to, we'll send you this PowerPoint afterwards, and you'll have all of our info. So our agenda for this lunchtime chat, we are going to give, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of TANF, which is also known as welfare or cash benefits. We are also going to talk about the options for survivors of domestic violence at the CSO or the welfare office. And then we are going to talk about some other rules that affect survivors that I think would be handy for y'all to know. We'll dig into child support and information that I think you might find helpful. We'll talk about connecting survivors to the help that's out there in those systems. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. And also anytime. So I may pause not just at the end, but ask you for feedback and questions. The way I like to do these kinds of things is if you've got a question about something we were talking about right then, please ask. So the best way that to do that is your little control panel will have a thing that says questions and answers. Also has a chat box. You can choose either, but you can enter your question into that, and we'll look at them from time to time, especially after I ask it, if anybody has any questions, and we can get your questions answered in that way. Right. Oops. Oops. Too fast. All right. So so a little bit more about what we're talking about today. Families who access TANF have options in their required activities when they are experiencing abuse in their relationships, which is good news. We actually have some really great policy here in Washington State and some structure around like implementing that policy that makes it work well. So I want to talk about that today. And some of the families, those same families accessing TANF have options regarding cooperating or not with the Division of Child Support. We will dig into that information as well. But I would love to know a little bit about who's here. So I'm going to launch a poll. And I want you to answer the questions. Have you ever heard of something called the Family Violence Option, or the FVO? And did you know that it's possible to be on TANF and not cooperate with the Division of Child Support? So I'm going to, hopefully this will work. I'm going to launch the poll. Take the poll. Should be in front of you, hopefully. Oh, yes, good. People are taking it. I'll just wait a moment while we watch the numbers come in. Almost everybody voted. All right, still coming in. All right. So it looks like most people haven't heard of the family violence option, but some have, so that's great. Some of this might be a little bit of review, but maybe you have some detailed questions about it, and I'd love to hear about those today and dig into that. And most of you didn't know or are not sure about the question around cooperating with the Division of Child Support. All right, good. So I'm gonna end that poll. Oh, look, I can share the results with you. There you go. Yay. All right. I'm gonna close that and move forward. I also am gonna open the chat because I want to make sure we want to make sure we don't have questions. Okay. So this is my alphabet soup because I've already used some of these acronyms in the 5 minutes I've been talking to you. And I'm not sure if you know what they mean. We all work, you know, adjacent to these systems with all of these sorts of acronyms. And I just want to make sure people know what I'm talking about. So I want you to take a moment. If you know what CSO stands for, type it into the chat box. CSO. Anybody? Yes. Winner. Ding, ding, ding. Community Service Office. Yes, yes. So that is also the welfare office. That is where people go to get help accessing TANF, food stamps, other cash benefit programs as well. DSHS, and we all probably know what DSHS means. The Division of, the Department of Social and Health Services. And so that's sort of the big umbrella that the department that we're talking about today is under, where the CSOs and also child support, you know, fall under the Division of Department of Social and Health Services. DCS, I'll use that acronym today. That stands for the Division of Child Support. TANF, who knows what those letters actually mean? We all know that that's welfare, right? That's the cash benefits check, but who knows? Who can type in the answer to what that stands for? Yes, temporary assistance for needy families. A quick history lesson, if anybody doesn't know, TANF has been the cash benefit, public benefit available to families since 1996. Before that, it was called AFDC, the Aid to Families of Dependent Children. And there's a distinction between those two. Mainly, the AFDC was an entitlement program. It meant that if you met income eligibility requirements, you could get your check and do the things you needed to do with it. TANF changed that when welfare reform happened in 1996, and that first word, temporary, the T in TANF, is, you know, a big deal for a lot of families, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But temporary assistance for needy families really does say something a lot different than aid to families of with dependent children. And the policies reflect that. And so we'll talk about how that affects survivors. Who knows what an IRP stands for? IRP. Anybody know? This is getting a little bit into the nitty-gritty of when folks are on TANF. Yes, Individual Responsibility Plan. So an IRP is the document, sort of a working document, that says what a person who is accessing TANF has to do, what activities they have to do, what kind of job search, what kind of job training, whatever it is that that they need to do, and how many hours they need to do it each week or each month in order to continue to qualify for that benefit check. So that's what an IRP is. And we will talk more about that when we talk about what kinds of activities are countable on IRPs for survivors, for people experiencing abuse in their relationships. The NCP and CP, who knows what those acronyms stand for? I may use those today. I want to make sure people know what I'm talking about. I'll give you a hint. They have to do with child support, the child support side of things. Okay, so these are are acronyms you may not have heard of, but CP stands for custodial parent, and NCP stands for non-custodial parent. And if you're working at all with folks who are accessing child support or the child support system in general, you might come across these acronyms. People talk about families using these acronyms a lot at DCS. So the custodial parent is the parent who has custody of the child more than 50% of the time. So most of the time. The non-custodial parent is the parent that doesn't have custody of the child or children for more than 50% of the time. And the last but not least, the FVO. I told you earlier what that stood for, which is Family Violence Option. And
Yay!
Family Violence Option. Now, the Family Violence Option is a federal policy, and we will dig into this in a minute, but it is a federal policy that allows for exceptions, some flexibility around, whoa, hey, that just made the CSO dance. Oh man, I didn't realize these have animations. Oh, look at that. Oh, there we go. I just wanted to lay these out for you while I finish up talking about the Family Violence Option. This is the policy, it's a federal policy that offers survivors more options, more flexibility for activities that will count for them to be able to access TANF. So it is super important and very, very exciting and very good. All right. Before we continue, does anybody have any preliminary questions about any of just the nitty-gritty details and the acronyms that we just talked about? You can type it into the chat.
I'm wondering, this is Lee, I'm wondering if there are any home visitors on the call who've actually worked with families where the family violence option was in play and there was discussions about what was going to go on the individual responsibility plan.
Do you want them to raise their hands if that's a yes?
Yes, raise your hand. Or
I think you have a little button that says raise your hand, so you can raise your hand.
Okay.
If you have worked with someone who's been accessing family violence options.
Okay, so I see, let me see, how many hands are up there?
Just
three.
Three.
Okay, great. So we're hoping Jessica, Laura, Kristen, and Jessica. Oh no, they're the same people.
Yeah.
If you all have questions about any of that today, it would be helpful for everyone to learn from your experience, what worked and what didn't work to be successful. So feel free to raise your hand because you want to talk, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, raise your hand. You would like to be unmuted, or type in something in the chat box. Thanks.
And let us know.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So this is, I call this TANF review because it probably is review for most of you, but I wanted us to make sure we were all on the same page before I launch into the weeds on some of the policies, because if you don't understand these points, you may be lost later. So someone on TANF must participate in work, job search, and or other barrier reduction activities in order to get their TANF grant. And that is the big difference between TANF that came on the scene in 1996 versus what we used to have previous to that, which was AFDC. You didn't have to do things in order to get the cash grant, and now you do. That's the way it's been since 96. They can create an IRP. So clients create an IRP with their caseworker at the CSO that outlines what the activities are and how many hours a week they must do them. So that's what the IRP is for. It's that outline. If they don't participate in those activities that are outlined in their IRP, they risk sanction, which is a significant reduction in their TANF grant. And then there's ways to fix that and a process to go through, which I can answer questions about if people have those later. But that's the basics. If you don't participate, then you most likely will be sanctioned. And what that means is they significantly reduce your TANF grant. As long as people are participating in the activities that are outlined in their IRP and they continue to meet income eligibility requirements, they should continue to get the TANF grant until they hit 60 months. And that is not necessarily 60 months in a row. that is total in their lifetime. After 60 months, their benefits end unless they qualify for an extension. And this did not used to be the case in Washington State, because we had something called state family assistance, and we had a law that allowed, like, it was sort of just seamless. Like, if you came up to your 60 months before 2011, you were participating, you just kept going. You just, like, they were like, okay, we can't access the federal funds anymore because this is a federal rule, but the state will continue to cover you because you are participating. You're doing the things outlined in your IRP. You're doing the things that are helping reduce those barriers to success, right? We're going to recognize that, and we're going to keep it going. After the recession in 2011, the state balanced the budget differently, and they implemented that hard 60-month time limit that mirrors the federal government's requirements. All right. Oops. So the family violence option. Oh, there's a question. Let me see. Sarah asks, how often is income eligibility reassessed? That is a good question. They will reassess every 6 months, I believe. So, and they are required to update so they're required to update like if there are any changes, sort of as those changes happen. People accessing TANF are, but they will be reassessed twice a year. Good question. All right, so the family violence option or the FVO so I'll tell you a little story about it first, and then we'll get into the details of it, the reason why it's here. Because in 1996, like I mentioned, when AFDC turned into TANF, and you had to then now work or look for work in order to qualify, a lot of advocates for survivors of domestic violence around the country got really worried and said, wait, this is not going to work for us, because before we had been helping survivors, like a big key piece of the work we've been doing with survivors is connecting them to community resources when they leave an abusive relationship, possibly plunged into poverty, right? We get them connected to AFDC, they qualify, and then we're good to go. And then they can go off, and then we can help them do the other things they need, like housing and support group and, figuring out kids' school and all that sort of stuff, right? But if they have to, but the advocates realized they are not ready, by and large, the folks that we work with, the survivors that we work with, are not ready to just go to work. Oftentimes they don't have high school diplomas sometimes, or college degrees. They don't have a work history because they haven't been allowed to work. They don't have, they're not, just emotionally and psychologically ready for that yet. They've got some other work that they need to do in order to set up success for themselves later. And so advocates came together around the country, talked to our, senators and representatives, and our own Senator Patty Murray and the late Senator Paul Wellstone in Minnesota came together and championed a bill through Congress, which was the family violence option. So basically, and all states have adopted it, by 1998. I think all states had adopted it as part of their state rules, that they would follow the family violence option. And it says to do three things. It says to screen and identify individuals receiving assistance. So they need to talk about it with folks and figure out if that's something that they are experiencing. They have to refer those individuals to counseling and supportive services. That includes, maybe their domestic violence advocacy program in their community, or somebody on site who's been trained in issues surrounding abuse in relationships. And the third piece is that they have to waive other program requirements, and they give some examples, but this isn't an exhaustive list, like time limits, residency requirements, child support cooperation requirements, and family cap provisions. In cases where complying with those requirements would make it more difficult for those receiving the assistance to escape domestic violence, unfairly penalize those who are experiencing or have experienced violence, or put folks at further risk of domestic violence. And this is language straight out of the language that you see is the language that came straight out of the policy. So that the family violence option allows us to do a lot of things with survivors, which is great. One of the ways, like I said, you know, all the states have adopted the family violence option at this point. I will say Washington was an early adopter, so good for us. And they recognized right off the bat that that they wanted to do this in a way that was meaningful. They wanted to implement this policy in a way that was meaningful. And so so DSHS contracted with WSCDF, our coalition, back in 1998, and we worked together with them to create a pilot program at first, and now something that is in the majority of CSOs across the state, which was having local CSOs contract with their local domestic violence advocacy programs and have an advocate on site for a specific number of hours per month, so that they would have somebody there as an expert in-house for general questions, training, support for their staff. They would have somebody on site to refer to because they're doing those screenings. And so when they get a yes, when they identify that someone is experiencing this, they can have an expert on site to refer them to. And then that advocate can then work with the survivor to create, to help make suggestions and help create that IRP, that individual responsibility plan, that can include domestic violence advocacy, tasks, can include things like, and we'll talk more about what those are in a minute, but they can do things that will help them deal with the abuse that they've experienced, and those activities can be counted as hours, as work on their IRP, so that they can qualify for TANF. So you can email me if you want to know who your DV advocate is, local DV advocate is in your CSO. You can also, the best case scenario is just contacting someone you know at your local CSO, or calling the front desk there and asking them if they have one and who that is, and if you can connect and sort of build that relationship there. They are a great resource to know in your community, that local CSO domestic violence advocate.
So let me ask you some questions, Tracy.
Okay.
Just things that have come up talking with home visitors, and see if this resonates for anyone on the call. So I know you can have families who are really concerned about sharing with workers at a CSO that they're experiencing abuse because they're afraid their children will be taken away from them, or they're afraid that they have to have some kind of proof, or that they have to be separated from the person causing harm, like no longer in a relationship. And sometimes people, if you know there's an advocate working in your CSO office, sometimes a family member may feel more comfortable, a home visitor you're working with, if you establish a relationship with the advocate, talking to that advocate first and strategizing what they're going to share with the CSO worker, how much, what, enough to get the family violence option and to get some things rolling that will be supportive for your family, but also making sure that the family feels comfortable and supported around having some trust around what kind of information am I revealing, how far is it going, who knows. So I heard Sarah said that she's heard all those concerns. So just to put it back to you all, especially for the home visitors who said earlier they have used the family violence option, have you had that experience where you've like reached out to the advocate first and figured out what the parent survivor might share or address those concerns. So just back to the folks first. If anybody wants to talk, you can raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you.
We'll wait a moment. If you're raising hands, I'm looking. Or if you're typing, keep typing. Okay.
Okay, so maybe that you are working with a parent who's a survivor who, you find out they already have the family violence option as a part of their IRP, but just thinking about it from a strategic perspective and building our partnerships with the advocacy programs, this is a great example of like how you can use advocates to your advantage, not when someone's in a crisis. Often we think we're only going to call the advocacy program when someone's in a crisis or they want to go to court or they're ready to do something. Here's a really good example of strategizing with that advocate that works at the CSO. You and the parent could have a conversation outside of the CSO, could have a three-way conference call, whatever works for you all, to be like, here is the parent, my fears around what I can talk about and can't talk about because I don't want to lose my kids, but I'd like to have more of this option that you, the home visitor, have been explaining because you've been on this fabulous webinar with us, like, hey, there's some more flexibility. So I'm hoping that gets you thinking about like introducing yourself to the advocate, finding out there is one, introducing yourself, finding out their hours, and start working on that relationship. Does that make sense to people? Great.
Rianne says, I'm not sure if everybody can see the chat on the webinars, so I'm gonna read what somebody says. We often take our clients to the CSO to meet with advocates or when updating their IRP with workers and making sure that parents feel comfortable with what is shared and how and where the information goes. That's fantastic because what we do know. You have a great relationship.
So Ryan,
what CSO?
Yeah, what home visiting program are you working with?
While they're typing, I will say that we know that you're in an Olympia. Great.
And where's your Parents as Teacher program? What organization are you attached to in Olympia?
Community Youth Services. Cool.
Thank you. Okay.
Excellent.
Great.
So that is such a great example, I think, of what Lee was talking about in community building and relationship building with CSO advocates. They they are CSO advocates, DV advocates, including the ones who are contracted with the CSOs, have different confidentiality rules that they follow than the CSO. Like staff does. And so it is important to talk with folks and figure out and to help you understand so that you can help the folks you're working with understand, like if they talk to an advocate, they can tell them a lot more. And that advocate cannot legally actually say anything to the CSO unless that survivor gives them explicit permission to do so. And a
release of information,
right? They have to have a release of information, and not the one that they signed for the CSO that like sort of lets the CSO talk about their issues with kind of everybody. Their information at the CSO does kind of go everywhere if it gets into their system. But talking with the DV advocate at the CSO doesn't mean that information is going into their system. In fact, DV advocates are very protective of what information they have to enter in order to coordinate services and make sure that they, are doing the things that they have to for their IRP versus like the details of their situation and what they need to know what advocates need to know in order to support that person. Most of that information that they gather from working with a survivor does not go into the CSO computer systems and notes pages, right? That information is too sensitive and should not be there. And so on the flip side of that, mistakes happen. So if you're ever working with somebody who feels like there's information in that system that is alarming, that have had a bad reaction from the person causing harm in their lives because they were able to see that information or what have you. You can talk to your advocate, local advocate. You can also contact me. And I can help you, along with the folks you're working with, contact the people at headquarters who can get that info out of there. So that's just a good resource and thing for you to know too, is like that if there is sensitive information in the CSO system for survivors that should not be there, we can help you get that out.
That's so awesome to hear, Tracy.
Yes.
So I just want to summarize again to just be really clear that the domestic violence advocates that work at the CSOs are not supervised by the staff at the CSOs. They're supervised by their own programs.
Correct.
We have legal obligations separate from the CSOs to keep the written and oral communications of survivors confidential. So we have our own record keeping separate again. And if there's information in CSO records that is damaging to the survivor, it's causing problems, Tracy, and she's got a little cape and a magic wand, sometimes flies around on something, can help you get that information out. Like you're not stuck. Not stuck with that.
Yeah, I'm not going to take credit for that because the reason that I say contact me is because I have some really great allies at DSHS headquarters in policy who are completely on board with our vision and mission around helping survivors access the system, and they will agree with me if there's something alarming, and they will get that out of there. So. All right. I'm looking at my slide to make sure I said everything on here. Yeah. All right. Next. Here are some concrete examples of what survivors might actually have on their IRP that can count as hours that then can count towards the total for what they're doing in order to get TANF, which can be very, very helpful because, like I said earlier, often survivors are at a place where work or job search or job training even aren't their top priority. They aren't at a place where they can think about that. They aren't at a place where that's actually going to be helpful for them right now because of the crisis they're experiencing. Most of the time, I will say that survivors who are accessing TANF, they oftentimes do want to work or do job search or job training or school and like part-time on their IRP, and they want some other things like these examples to be included. So that's many times that's what advocates, on-site CSO advocates can help them do, is sort of say, because I used to be one of those advocates at the CSOs here in Seattle, and I was like, so many times survivors would come to me and say, I need all the things that you have just offered me from your program. I need that legal advocacy. I need housing help. I want to go to support group. That sounds like I could really benefit from those things. And like the thing that's rising to the top for me right now is I need a job. And in order to get a job, I need some job training because I have been like kept out of the workforce for so long, right? So advocates should be listening to those survivors, CSO advocates, and saying, great, you don't have to do one or the other, right? We can do part-time job training and we can do part-time this in order to fill your IRP requirements. So these are some things: individual advocacy and safety planning, support group, legal advocacy, and the time spent dealing with all the legal issues and being tied up in court, which can take many hours for a lot of people. Securing safe housing, going to parenting classes or parent-child therapy to heal from the abuse, anything non-work related that's necessary for the survivor to reduce barriers that was created by the abuse. It's very flexible. And Veronica asked what qualifies as a parenting class. If you are working with a CSO advocate and they are, wanting to do parenting classes, I think that it can be flexible, especially if it's something regarding domestic violence. Like some of our programs offer like parenting type classes, and those would absolutely qualify under the family violence option. they also might just add, like each CSO, I think, also has options that qualify for a parenting class. And, you know, that would certainly qualify if if the CSO is saying, but if you're having trouble, are you having trouble with certain parenting classes that you're recommending or that you like for folks being able to be counted? Oh, and
So
I'll wait for Veronica to respond, but Sarah says Circle of Security is a fantastic class if it would qualify and if families can find a facilitator.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with that curriculum. I guess Circle of Security, I agree, Sarah. I mean, I think the thing we want to put out there is like, there doesn't have to be some kind of proof around this equals a certain, you know, this is an evidence-based parenting class. And because you're also trying to think about providing parenting support with the person causing harm not involved. Sometimes parenting classes want all the parents there, and that would be a challenge because of the person causing harm. Maybe a survivor would want the parent there, the partner there, but like you want to have that open. But no, there's not a specific criteria. The other thing that I just want to put out there that I think is a great example, I remember looking at an IRP where a domestic violence advocate had worked with the CSO to say, this mom needs to spend time with their child in a park just playing. They need time together to heal for their abuse, to work on their relationship, to bond. They need like 5 hours a week or whatever it was. It was some amount of money, excuse me, some amount of time that made total sense. Maybe in the community there wasn't a parenting class, but it's like that survivor said, I just need time from the list of everything everyone's expecting me to do. I need time with my child. And so to really think creatively, really listen carefully to what I know you all do, but listen very carefully to what your parents are saying are their priorities and what they need first, and then working with the advocate to get that parent survivor what they need.
I think that's such a great point, Lee, and I love that example. And it does underline the flexibility that the family violence option allows. Like, it's not prescriptive and it's written broadly on purpose because survivors need many different things, right? They need them in different ways. And so if there's not a parenting class available and a class really isn't what they need to like repair and heal, and it's time in a park or whatever it is, the family violence option, you know, would allow for that. Now, the challenge there then is that, and that's why relationship with the CSO advocate and with other caseworkers at your CSO is so key, because it, you know, a caseworker isn't necessarily going to have the, you know,
same information.
The same information, and also the understanding about all the different details of the family violence option, the policies. There are so many policies that they are like having to hold, right? That they don't necessarily, they might not think like, they might not be thinking outside the box like we are right now around what is best for that survivor and what they need in order to be successful and stable and get to the next step in, you know, being, you know, happy, healthy, working family, right? So it's our job as advocates and, you know, as people who are connected more to like the whole of the family and what's happening there, to help that person advocate for themselves or advocate for them and speak up and help them figure out what can work.
I mean, I was just trying to think of some other examples that I've seen that are out of the box. So maybe as part of the IRP plan, the parent survivor is getting to participate in an ESL class or getting to participate in some other kind of activity that's happening at a local community-based organization where that family member feels really comfortable. So just like, and then you being able to tell the CSO worker with hopefully the advocate at your side that there's a lot of flexibility here, and if what we want is a family that's self-sufficient and loving and able to raise their children in loving relationships, this kind of work needs to happen when coercion and abuse is going on. And people don't have to be separated, because or they can still even be together, because we know, especially when children are involved, that the parent survivor you're working with is going to have very highly likely to have ongoing contact, may still love their partner, but want them to do better, don't want the abuse to be happening, and they're struggling with like how to balance what's going on, and they need to live and take care of their children.
Yeah, Marie says that her CSO will count the time spent with the NFP nurse home visitor to fulfill their hours.
Wonderful.
That's awesome.
Where are you, Marie? What program and what community?
What CSO, yeah.
That's a great example.
All right.
Okay.
Oh, Benton Franklin. Great. And they have an on-site advocate as well.
Great.
All right. So we're going to move on from the IRP, but if you have lingering questions, type them in. Oh, I should check up here. No new questions. Okay. I want to move on to another policy that affects survivors, which is that 5-year time limit, that 60-month lifetime limit on TANF. There are extensions available for those who are experiencing domestic violence. There are other extensions as well. I'm not an expert in those, so I'm not going to talk about those today, but I know there's a mental health one, there's a disability one, there's several different extensions. And so domestic violence is one of them. And in order for the survivor to get that domestic violence time limit extension, they must do two things, essentially. They have to disclose to their caseworker that they have experienced domestic violence at some point in their lives. It can be now that they're experiencing it, but it also could be 7 years ago that they experienced it. And the reason the policy exists that way is because we understand that getting safe and stable after a domestic violence situation takes a long time. It can take actual years, right? Like a very long time. And so they have to disclose that domestic violence is something that they've experienced now or in the past. And they have to participate in some kind of domestic violence activity on their IRP. I also put in there they need to ask for it, because oftentimes it's not offered. Sometimes they'll just be like, oh, you've reached your 60 months and we're cutting you off. So like somebody needs, like sometimes that person needs to say, is there a way to extend? Like, I've experienced domestic violence, like I want that extension if they know about it. Hopefully most people are getting the information of like all the extensions available. What CSO staff should be doing is when they come up to a 60-month case, they are giving folks, they're like telling people, okay, here's now what's up. We have to, your TANF must end unless you qualify for one of these extensions. Let's talk about that, right? And so they should be doing that. Sometimes they don't, and that's another place where advocacy can come in.
And this is another place that's tricky. So, I mean, let's just be real. I've had CSO workers say to me, this person is just disclosing domestic violence now because they want an extension. Why didn't they tell me before? Mm-hmm. Not believing, not trusting the information, thinking that this parent survivor is just trying to manipulate the system. And so that's, again, where working with advocates and knowing your advocates in your community, even if they don't work in the CSO, can be really helpful, because, I always think about, the first thing I always think about when I hear that is like, well, what is the benefit of a parent survivor telling the caseworker they're experiencing domestic violence if they don't know what's going to happen, if they're afraid they're going to lose their children, if they're fearful about, they've had poor experiences in the past working with the system, if they just don't know what to expect. And we don't know what the conditions are in a person's life that they're now able to share that information. So
yeah, the message
I don't know if you've heard that before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The message that I know advocates are sending and that we like to send, and it would be great if you adapted it too, is around this issue when you get that reaction, if you are like experiencing that, is that, we already know that most people who have experienced domestic violence and are on TANF don't disclose. We can look at the numbers. We know national data says that 50 to 70% of people on TANF have experienced domestic violence at some point in their lives. 50 to 70% of those on TANF have experienced domestic violence at some point in their lives. The percentage of folks who are in Washington State who have what we call an XF component, which is just a weird code for this person has a family violence service plan and has family violence activities on their IRP. That percentage of TANF folks in Washington State who have that is 7%.
7%?
7%.
Wow.
Okay, so we know that people don't disclose, right? We know that. And there's a lot of good reasons why people don't disclose. They don't understand why they need to tell you about their, or not you, but they don't understand why they need to tell their caseworker about their relationship problems because they're here to get a check, right? Like there's enough, if workers, if folks at the CSO aren't connecting the dots for people, they don't disclose. Survivors often tell us, I wasn't gonna say anything that was gonna make me seem like a problem case, right? Like I needed that check. I'm not going to present a problem to them, right? They don't need to know that. So there are a lot of really good reasons why people don't disclose. And so that's what we say when we come up against this issue around the 5-year time limit. Like people are just abusing it. They're just going to say that like that's too easy of a qualifier. Like they're just going to say that they have experienced domestic violence. And so I say a couple of things to that. I say it's actually pretty hard for anybody to say that they're, to admit that they've experienced something like this. Also, there are a lot of people who have experienced it on your caseloads. We know that already, who haven't disclosed because of the data. We know this. And people don't disclose until they have a really good reason to. And this is that really good reason. People aren't going to go into it unless they feel like they have a very good reason, unless they feel like there's something in it for them, right? And staying on TANF happens to be a really good reason to feel strong enough or to feel compelled enough to have to disclose that information. And so those are the messages that we try to send to staff who get grouchy about people, theoretically taking advantage of this. I also say that, folks have to participate in some kind of domestic violence activity on their IRP. So they have to follow through. So it kind of is a fail-safe anyway. Like somebody might disclose DV and maybe they don't really have it, or it's not something that they need help with right now. And they're not gonna follow through on their participation with that. And then they'll go through the, their policies and their procedures that they go through when somebody doesn't follow through on their IRP and they're over their 5-year time limit. And we also look at data quarterly on this. And there's nothing about the numbers, the larger numbers, that indicate that it is being used willy-nilly and that people are, in fact, the opposite. We'd like to see the numbers increase a little bit. So
do you have to prove in any way that you're a victim of domestic violence?
No, that's an excellent question. And we'll talk about proof in a minute when we talk about child support, but it's the same exact language for the child support as it is for getting the 5-year time limit. All you have to do is say that you are experiencing this. Like you don't have to offer a letter from an advocate. You don't have to offer protection orders or police reports. Nobody at the CSO should be requiring any of that kind of documentation to access any of the protections I'm talking to you about today.
If you're getting that, call Tracy.
Yeah. Or talk to your advocate, your local advocate as well. But I'm happy to know about it too. Another requirement that folks have to do, and this may be changing because there was this big hairy bill in the last legislative session that did a lot, that potentially changed a lot of information around TANF and the requirements and whatnot. And the orientation was part of that, maybe getting rid of it or maybe doing it in a different way. And what I don't know is what actually landed, where workforce orientation landed in that bill. And it certainly, hasn't gone into effect or anything like that yet. So that's all to say that, so what I'm telling you right now is accurate information for folks accessing the system right now around orientation. That might change depending on what's in this bill later. But at this time, everybody has to complete an orientation before they can get their TANF grant. And sometimes that is problematic for survivors because sometimes survivors have a hard time getting to the CSO because their transportation and just their whereabouts are being controlled by their abusive partner. And so that can be a problem. And so there are exceptions to attending the orientation if there are safety concerns or if domestic violence is preventing them from getting to an orientation in a timely manner. They can ask for like an over-the-phone orientation from their worker or something like that, and that can count so that they can then start that check, because their check does not, like their start date doesn't happen until after they have completed an orientation.
And that information, again, may not be offered to you when you're working with a family who are accessing TANF benefits. So we thought it was important for you to know that there still are exceptions, even if the CSO worker did not tell you that.
Yes. Child support. Now we're going to dig into this. So accessing TANF means an automatic referral to the Division of Child Support. As soon as somebody goes on TANF, once they complete the paperwork and once they are, like, they do their eligibility and are entered into that system after they meet with a worker and, you know, get that entered into the system, it's 24 hours later that a referral shows up at the Division of Child Support. It is automatic and very fast. So people who are experiencing domestic violence and have fears and concerns about what the other parent might do, that is considered good cause to not cooperate with the Division of Child Support. But they have to know where to check that box and what words to say in order to get that protection sometimes before that automatic referral goes through. So we're going to dig into the details about that. First, I want to say there are ups and downs to child support, right? Like regular child support can be really helpful to survivors. Additional monthly income is awesome. Steady monthly income that's bigger than their TANF check so they don't have to be on TANF and jump through all the hoops, awesomer, right? But we also know that that's not the reality of how survivors often experience child support, you know, when they are trying to access it from the person who's causing harm in their lives. Access to money and resources helps make survivors safer. And going after child support can be a huge safety risk for many survivors because it can escalate a situation. It can escalate, it can add something extra into a situation that they were just barely managing, right? It can increase the danger levels for survivors. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've worked with survivors over the years, and advocates continue to tell me this, where they say, look, he's made a specific threat about child support to me, right? It's actually pretty common, right? Where somebody causing harm in their partner's life will say, if you ever think about going after child support, I'll make sure I get custody. That's a big threat, right? And so for those folks who feel like it is just not safe to access child support, they can claim good cause to not cooperate with DCS. So what I am encouraging folks to do is don't wait for the CSO worker to bring it up, to ask about it or to bring it up, right? Like if the survivor knows going into it before they apply that this is something that is going to be a requirement, they should ask. They should make sure that they found the right form, that they ticked the right box so that they can ask for good cause to not cooperate because they are worried about what would happen if they involve this abusive partner with this system. Good cause can be claimed at any time while someone's accessing TANF. So they can claim it. Maybe you're working with folks who, I mean, we are all working with folks who have been in generational poverty. They maybe been on TANF for a long time, but now they're in a situation with a new partner and a new child that it's dangerous to pursue child support with. They can claim good cause right away. As soon as they realize that this is not going to be a good idea, they can claim good cause to not cooperate. As soon as they make that claim, Division of Child Support on that end should pend any further action while they wait for the CSO to make a decision about that good cause request. This is how somebody can claim good cause to not cooperate with the Division of Child Support. It's a part of their application packet, this form called the 18334. It's titled Your Options for Child Support Collection While Receiving TANF or Medical Assistance. And there's a portion on that form that says, you know, I don't agree to cooperate, and then a place where they can outline their fears and concerns and sign it. And that, if they outline their fears and concerns about why accessing child support would be a terrible idea for them right now and their family and their children, and they sign it, that is all the quote unquote proof that anybody needs to make a decision about good cause. They cannot, in fact, according to DSHS policies, require a protection order, a police report, medical reports, a letter from the advocate, a letter from their clergy. Like, they cannot require any other documentation. The only thing that's required is that that survivor clearly outlines their fears and concerns and signs it.
Tracy, can you give some examples of what you've seen when survivors are saying, outlining their fears and concerns?
Yeah, oftentimes they're saying, if I cooperate with child, I mean, sometimes they'll tell the details of their story and get specific, and, you know, about their abuser's behavior, that like how volatile that partner is, you know, actual threats that have been made, like I mentioned earlier, around like, if you go after child support, I'm going to get custody of the kids. They can outline those fears. They can, if they want to be more general, that's also acceptable. If they don't want to put the details of their situation, they don't have to be super detailed. They just have to say, you know, I have been in an abusive relationship with these kids' father for, you know, this long. You know, he has made specific threats about going after child support, or even if that person hasn't made specific threats about going after child support, they could say, you know, I have to carefully weigh all of my decisions because I know I'm being, you know, monitored or watched, and this is something that would absolutely escalate the violence. This would send him flying off the handle. I'm worried.
This would make things worse.
This would make things worse. I'm worried about what he will do when DCS contacts him. I'm worried about what he will try and go get the children from school, right? I'm worried that he, you know, those sorts of things are clearly outlined, fears and concerns about the effects of accessing child support, of DCS getting involved.
So does anyone have any questions about what a statement from a parent survivor, like what they might say or not say? You want to ask any questions here?
Okay. If you're still typing, keep typing. I'm going to move on to the next thing, and I'll come back if I see something pop up.
Can we see raised hands?
Oh, let me check raised hands.
Let's see if we have any raised hands. Any questions?
Nope, no raised hands. Okay. All right. Oh, I already said that.
Yeah.
No proof required. Assigned statements, all the proof needed. Other documents actually cannot be required by the CSO per their policies. And if you ever need those policies, I can lay my hands on them very quickly and send them to you in an email. So if you need backup, I'm also good for that. Like if you're like, I know Tracy said that this was the rule, but I don't know how to like find that in order to like, you know, arm you with that proof as you go in and like try to advocate for yourself. I can find this very quickly. I am quite familiar with that section of the handbook. So let me know. So some other things to think about around the Division of Child Support. Sometimes survivors think that, or anybody, just aren't worried about the cooperating with the Division of Child Support because they're like, they're never going to find him. They're not going to, he works under the table. There's no way. I am not even worried about it because they will not be able to like garnish wages or even find him, right? And here's what I say, and what I hope advocates are, like what I encourage advocates to talk about with survivors is DCS is very good at finding people. It is their number one job. Like, that is what they do. The people they hire are super good at this. They have access to lots of different ways that they can find people, right? There are a lot of computer interfaces and different systems that they have access to in order to find that non-custodial parent. So, and DCS uses creative ways to get an NCP to pay. Sometimes they're like, well, they might find him, but they won't make him, he's not going to pay, right? There's no way they'll pay. But there's a lot of ways that DCS, you know, can get somebody to pay, including like suspended licenses, seizure of property, of cars and boats. And so, you know, survivors are often talking advocates are often talking to survivors about like, hey, did you know this about the Division of Child Support? Did you know that if he doesn't pay, you know, they could suspend his license, including like a commercial license if that's like the job, like needed for a job, because oftentimes that kind of a thing again will increase the violence. Will be the thing that, you know,
causes retaliation.
It's something that a survivor has to safety plan around if they are working with the Division of Child Support, or it might be a reason why they might then say, oh, actually, wait, good cause might be a good option for me, right? So these are some details around, you know, just some of the things that advocates are helping survivors think about and talk about if they get to talk to an advocate before they do this. So often they don't. And so that's why we're telling you, because sometimes you're the person they're talking to before they do this.
Yeah, so you don't expect that a CSO worker will tell survivors about the good cause option. I just want to reemphasize again, Tracy, let's say a referral went for child support. Can you start the good cause process later on? Or does it only have to happen at the beginning?
No, you can request good cause at any time. But once you request good cause, once you fill out that 18334 form and say and outline fears and concerns, right? Then good cause goes pending and DCS stops working the case if they had started. Or if they're doing this all at the beginning of their application process, then DCS never opens a case.
Which is
right?
Obviously the optimum.
Which is like ideal. And then the CSO worker, somebody at the CSO, sometimes it's that worker, sometimes it's the supervisor. It's different in every CSO as far as who is approving good cause requests. So that's also maybe something good to find out in your local CSO, who's approving good cause requests. Because sometimes it's not that person's worker, like caseworker. Sometimes it's their social service specialist. Sometimes it's the supervisor of the social service specialists. It can vary from office to office.
And I want to give you a story about that.
Okay.
Here's why it's good to find out, because this is where you can work with an advocate, or you might be having that conversation yourself. I've had CSO workers say, well, this couple is bad. She's just having another baby again with this person. She must not be that afraid. And again, not understanding that actually she may not have had any control around the pregnancy, around birth control use, or any of that, or access to birth control, and maybe have experienced the fancy term of reproductive and sexual coercion. So again, in our role from the coalition, we're trying to spend time challenging myths people have around what they think is going on in an abusive and coercive relationship. So that worker, or the person who makes the decision in the CSO, they're going to have their own frame of reference, bias, understanding around what it's like to live in a coercive and abusive relationship. So it's important to know who that person is, and make your partnership with the advocacy program, because sometimes good cause is denied and they don't really understand what's happening. And
good cause shouldn't be denied even on that, even if that person thinks that, because the only thing that person who's making those good cause determinations in the office should be basing their decision on is to answer the question, did this person clearly outline their fears and concerns and sign it?
Mm-hmm.
If the answer to that is yes, they should be approving, rubber stamped approved. And we know that's not necessarily always the reality. And what Lee says is super important and such a great opportunity to do some education, build a relationship with that person making those good cause determinations in your office. But they should be approving good cause requests if they have clearly outlined fears and concerns in 3 or 4 sentences. They don't have to write a dissertation, right? And signed it.
Any questions here?
Checking. Hands. Okay. Oops. Sorry, technical difficulties. So, who decides about child support? Like I said, so that's what we just talked about. You know, it is up to the caseworker or whoever is assigned that. It might be the social service specialist, it might be a supervisor, but it's on the CSO side of things. They are making the decision. If somebody you're working with disagrees with their good cause decision, or they didn't know it was an option, the person that they need to talk to is at the CSO. People are compelled oftentimes to call DCS because they're like, oh God, like, I don't want child support doing this. I'm going to call child support because that is sensical, right? That makes sense. But actually, DCS is going to be like, my hands are completely tied. I can't help you at all. The person that you need, and they'll end up sending them back to the CSO, which can be frustrating. So if you can help folks understand that the person that they need to talk to, if they're on TANF and having trouble and having worries about child support, or wanting to claim good cause, or disagreeing with the decision about good cause, like all of that communication has to happen on the CSO side of things, not the DCS, not the Division of Child Support side of things. And that said, there are allies at your DCS office, experts in how like domestic violence interacts with their system and the protections available at DCS, because we've talked all about good cause and TANF today, because that's what we came to talk about. But there are ways for folks who are accessing child support, even if they're not on TANF, to get address protections and other things. You know, if they are going after child support, but they want their addresses protected, they want to see what options they have to maybe still try and access child support a little more safely, like a safer access of child support. And they're not on assistance, so it's not required, but it's something that they're pursuing. There are protections available, and the liaisons at each DCS office are super helpful. And I didn't give you their names because they change sometimes from time to time, but I will say Wiskative has a relationship with them. And you can call each of these, are the front desk at each of these offices, and you can call them and inquire about who their liaison is and start building a relationship with them too.
So could this liaison help? So let's say you're not happy with the decision at your local CSO. Can the liaison help you with the CSO?
No.
So what are your,
so the liaison yeah, that's a good question. If you're working with the CSO and you want help, and you want to get the person that you're working with help regarding child support, good cause, and child support for somebody on TANF, all of that stuff has to happen on the CSO side of things. So your best ally there is the CSO advocate, if you've got one, or whomever you've built relationships with there, that person who's making those good cause decisions. Like that's the relationship, that's the key relationship there at the CSO. But this is here in case you are working with folks that aren't on TANF, but maybe are thinking about being involved with the DCS system or already are. There are other protections available for survivors who aren't on TANF, but are accessing child support. And the DCS liaisons at these offices can help figure that out.
Okay, so you're not on TANF, you're interested in child support, but you want to know what protections there might be around confidentiality, like where your addresses, so the person causing harm can't find where you're living, or
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
All right. So a couple of other rules I want to go over before we have to end. There is something called an exception to rule, or an ETR, at the CSOs, which is great. Sometimes the written rules just don't work for a survivor and their unique situation. So if a survivor feels that like they, or if you feel like DSHS could help a survivor, like has the resources, but doesn't exactly qualify for a program, or a program requirement's not working for her, and it doesn't, and the worker's not, it doesn't sort of qualify under the things that can go on the IRP under the family violence option, the survivor can ask her worker about asking for an exception to rule. So the person that gets to ask for an exception to rule is the caseworker. They have to ask for it. So it's the survivor and advocates and your job to help convince that worker that an ETR in this situation is appropriate. I'll give an example. There is something called AREN funds, AREN funds, that folks who are on TANF have access to. They are funds that, it's additional requirements for emergent needs. That's what it stands for. And it's cash that everybody on TANF has a right to, if they qualify for up to $750 each year, and it renews yearly each year. And they it's necessary for, it's basically money that you need in order for like first month's written deposit help, or utilities help, or so if it has to do with housing and keeping your housing, or if it has to do with a job, so things that you might need, in order to get a job, or what have you.
Keep a job.
Or keep a job. There are a bunch of details around that, and so sometimes things survivors needs don't match up with that. Like sometimes a survivor needs us to get out of town now, right? And they don't have the money, and they're in a dangerous situation, and they have AREN funds that they haven't used this year. But that doesn't exactly fit into like the definition of what AREN funds are useful for. But I have had, that's a real example. I've had several advocates with working with survivors in similar situations get AREN funds for just that, right? Because they were able to convince their worker to ask for this exception to rule. So things like that. So if you're like, I feel like, this is something that would be really helpful, or actually this is something really necessary to your safety, right? And I know you've got access to these funds, but they don't quite line up. That's something that that a worker can do, is ask for an exception to rule. And the hardest part of that step is getting the worker in the local office to do it. Because once it goes through, I know the folks at headquarters who approve or don't those requests. And they basically are like, look, if there's something regarding domestic violence and a survivor needing something that comes across my desk, I'm gonna approve that, right? So really the biggest hurdle is convincing that worker to ask for it.
Has anyone heard of that before? AREN funds?
You can raise your hand if you have. How about that?
Yes.
Right.
Okay, Laura. Okay, awesome.
Or the AREN funds, or the exception to rule, you mean?
Oh, exception to rule.
Exception to rule, yeah.
Okay.
So there's some hands, a few hands, not many.
So thinking about using this in the context of a parent survivor who's experiencing coercion or abuse, or had, and just has some additional needs.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's for extenuating circumstances, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's not used very often, which it shouldn't be. It's not something it's an exception, right? But for survivors, oftentimes the need for an exception comes up because of their unique situations, and this is available to them if they can convince their worker to do it. The other piece, the thing I wanted to talk to you about, are administrative hearings. Oh, did I just close that? There we go. How many of you have heard of this before? You can raise your hand. Are aware of a person who's on TANF's right to an administrative hearing? because this isn't exclusive to survivors. This is anybody accessing TANF has the right. Okay, just a couple of you. Okay, good. I love it when we learn something new. So administrative hearings are a last resort, you know, and it is every person on TANF's right to an administrative hearing. And basically what it is if somebody on TANF disagrees with the decision that has been made about their case, they can make a request. And, you know, I think it's best to use this when you've exhausted all other options. It's much easier to get things righted when you have relationships and you can build those relationships, you can talk it out with workers and help and like get people in the office and figure it out, right? But sometimes that's not happening. And if a survivor wants to pursue it further, they can request an administrative hearing. And this is something that survivor can do themselves, or anybody, the person on TANF can do themselves. And they must, the request must be made by that person receiving benefits to their caseworker. In writing is best, but a verbal request is also acceptable and must be accepted, in fact. Written or verbal requests must be accepted and processed by that caseworker. So if somebody says, I'm requesting an administrative hearing, I disagree with the decision made about my good cause, right? And we haven't been able to figure this out otherwise, I'm requesting an administrative hearing. Their caseworker should not at that point say no. They can't say no. They can't say, wait, you know, let's see what else we can do, right? You like at that point, they have to process that request. Most of the time what I find is actually just requesting that then changes people's minds pretty quickly, and they don't actually get to the actual hearing part, right? Because it has to go up through the ranks at the CSO, and by the time their supervisor or the CSO administrator hears about this, they're like, wait, what happened? Okay, let's fix that, right? And so it actually doesn't even, a survivor doesn't even have to go through with the hearing oftentimes before it gets taken care of, because this is the thing that sort of gets people's attention. If we've been unsuccessful before then getting their attention about it. So I just want to put that out there. It is, what it does is if it does go to the hearing, it's heard by an administrative law judge who is not affiliated with DSHS. So it's a neutral party. And there is a person at the administrative hearings at the place that you know, deals with these, again, outside of DSHS, that once you request it, you get information about how, like, and a person that will help you, like, figure that out, sort of navigate that system.
Do you feel like, because I know that, like, some CSOs, depending on the supervisor or the CSO, can have reputations for being easier to communicate with, more difficult to communicate with. Does DSHS know when administrative hearings are happening out in the state at CSOs? Like, does that have any impact on maybe future, like, you know, helping to encourage the CSO to be more open in their thinking? And
I mean, it's less about, I think, public knowledge about the administrative hearings, like how many CSOs have this many administrative, but it does come through in the numbers. Like, CSOs are evaluated against each other a lot of times, you know, at headquarters. And like, no CSO wants to be the one that has the most administrative hearings, right? Like, that's not something that, it's not like public knowledge, but it's internal. Yeah.
internal
sure.
knowledge. Okay.
Yeah.
Because
I mean, it might be public, but no, I don't
Yeah.
think anybody cares that
Nobody
much about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just think that, like, you know, Tracy and I have worked here a long time. She's been a CSO advocate herself. You know, we've just seen that sometimes people have, I don't know, what's the word I want to use? Of resistance to maybe understanding the complexities of living in a coercive and abusive relationship. And we have seen administrative hearings help make a difference in kind of shifting the CSO's office's approach generally to all survivors coming through. So we say it's we see this as a last resort, but it's actually a tool, because this is a system that we all are responsible to and for, and we want people to be able to have an opportunity to build the kind of loving and healthy families that we all want to see in relationships.
Yes.
So we want to give you all the tools.
Excellent. Oops. All right, and now we're at the questions time about that, about anything we've talked about today, about, you know, have you worked with survivors who have struggled at the CSO? Like, what are the situations that are coming up for you as we talk about this that you're like, I wonder if, like, what are your questions there? Let me see. I have a hand raised. I'm not sure if that's just left over from the last question I asked, but Maricela, I will unmute you and talk to us. Are you, unmute. Oh, it's not letting me unmute you, so you might not have a microphone on your computer. If you have a question, you can type it in.
Or just any odd question that you just thought about, you've jotted down, or.
Julie, I see your hand up. I'm going to try to unmute you too. Are you unmuted? Oh. Julie, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I was wondering about how many hours a week people might be required to participate in some of the activities that we talked about.
Mm-hmm. So they have to they have to meet, I believe, 34 hours total. People like to, I mean, like workers oftentimes encourage folks to be somewhere between 34 and 40 hours. I mean, so like a work week.
Like a full-time, so even if they have young kids.
Yeah. There are some exceptions around if you've got kids under 2, and I'm not an expert on what those are, but I could find out for you. I mean, I think that they have certain waivers around if you are on TANF and you've got kids under 2.
And pregnancy.
And if you're pregnant, yeah.
That would be super helpful for us to know, because I'm an NFP nurse, so that's my population, pregnancy and up until 2.
Perfect. So yes, so that they do have, I believe they can, I will find the actual policy for you, details, but I do believe that folks have the option, those folks have the option of not participating, like not having anything specific to their IRP for a year.
Okay, so they could even just opt out completely.
Yes. So, and they don't, or if they are experiencing domestic violence, they could opt out completely except for support group and the other things that they're doing with the advocate.
Or calling an advocate,
right?
you know.
And like they can have that on their IRP, so that looks like they are, you know, they have some participation but not full participation, and because they're not required to.
Okay.
So there are some rules around young, pregnant and parenting young families.
Okay, yeah, that would be really helpful to
But
know.
otherwise, it is 34 hours a week, and so you've got to fill that with something. And so that can be all job search or job training,
Or it could be like,
or it's a combination of stuff.
talking
right?
with an advocate about your safety issues, or
It's 15 hours a week working on
Yeah.
housing, homelessness stuff with your advocate, and, you know, 2 hours a week in support group, and you know, another hour in one-on-one advocacy a week, whatever that is, plus then the rest of the time an education program or something like that, right?
yeah, getting support from you, going to a monthly activity that you all, or weekly activity that you all plan for families,
Yep.
or, you know, just you really I've always said to folks, be as creative as you want, because I just think the CSOs don't have, the worker just doesn't have the range of ideas in front of her that you would, if that makes sense. Like all the different ways you try to support and connect families and things you do with families too.
Right. Any any more questions, Julie, or can I lower your hand?
You can lower our hand, thank you.
Awesome.
Let's see, anybody else here?
I can't lower your hand, you have to, but that's fine.
Okay, did we see anyone else?
No, I think they float to the top when they raise their hand.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is
yeah, so let me see, I'm checking the chat and I don't see any questions. I'm also checking the Q&A, but I have lots of places y'all can ask questions. I'm making sure I'm not missing anybody. Okay, anybody else that has
any kind of
final
question?
questions, scenarios they wanted to run by? And if they're not coming right now, I understand, and I am here. Like, email me, with questions, I'm happy to discuss it that way.
And also, I just want to say, I wonder, like, if some of you all, if any of the callers have had actually their home visitor program named as something that a family has to participate in on their IRP. And if that's true, and there's someone causing harm in the household, you could probably try to figure out, or not necessarily in the household, but in relationship, you could probably still maybe even break down and think about activities you're doing as a part of the home visiting program that could, you know, cover a lot of hours to give that parent survivor breathing room to work on whatever actually is the priority that they need to address, if that makes sense for folks. And we can talk more about that too.
All right. Okay. I just want to say thank you. There's our contact info again. When you close out of this, or when I close us all out of this, there'll be a evaluation that pops up. Please take it. Let us know how we did, what we can do better. We read those. We take them to heart.
If you think that there's subject areas we should have focused on that we missed, or things you would like to see addressed in this kind of a survey, kind of a webinar, we'd be happy to do it. Like, this is kind of, we haven't done this many just for home visitors, so we're still working on what would be best for you all. So feel free to give your constructive criticism to us,
Yes.
because we want to do better ourselves. And thank you for your time, giving up your lunch period to be with us. And we really appreciate the work you're doing out in the community, helping us all build loving and healthy families and relationships. And we're just honored to be partnering with home visitors and really value your work.
Yes. We just had a last minute question about someone asked if we're sending a replay, and I'm not sure what that means, but we are recording this.
Yes.
And it will be up on our website at some point. And Lee, will you send something out about that?
Will I have people's evals and the evaluations?
Emails, you mean?
I mean, emails.
Yes. Yeah.
So I could send the PowerPoint slides out to folks who fill out. If you fill in an evaluation, I'll be able to send you some slides.
Yep. All righty. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for hanging with us over lunch. Have a good day.
Okay, now there's something I have to convert before you get out.
No, not from here, though.
You sure?